Don't expect anyone to come. Mom texted on my wedding day. Your sister's engagement is the family's priority. I just smiled. They had no idea I owned a $7 million beach estate in Malibu. When the photos hit Instagram, they froze. Have you ever been told your happiness could wait because someone else's was more important? My name is Maya Collins, and this is how I stopped waiting. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I grew up in Santa Barbara, in a neighborhood that always smelled faintly of salt and jasmine. The ocean was only 3 blocks away, but inside our house, it might as well have been a different world, quiet, air-conditioned, and orbiting around one person. My sister Brooke. From the day she could walk, she was the family's small, golden sun, the kind of child who drew applause just by entering a room. My parents adored her laughter, her dramatics, the way she made even ordinary moments feel like performances. I was the opposite, the calm one, the practical one. I didn't demand attention. I built things, fixed things, asked questions about how the world worked. In our house, that kind of curiosity didn't sparkle. It just filled the background, like the sound of the refrigerator or the ticking clock. On my 8th birthday, I remember asking for a cake shaped like a lighthouse. I was obsessed with them back then. The idea that a single tower of light could guide ships home through fog felt like magic. But when Mom brought the cake out, it was pink, covered with tiny ballet slippers made of sugar. Your sister already had the mold, she said, as if that explained everything. Brooke twirled beside her, wearing a tulle skirt and clapping for herself, while I blew out the candles and watched the wax drip onto the frosting. The picture from that day still exists somewhere, though if you look closely, you'll notice I'm the only one not looking at the camera. Everyone else is facing Brooke. Even the dog. There was another photograph, one that hurt in a quieter way. A family trip to the beach, our mother in a wide straw hat, Dad grinning, Brooke standing in front holding a bucket of seashells. When I found that same photo in the album years later, the edge had been trimmed neatly with scissors. My shoulder was still there, the edge of my blue swimsuit strap visible, but my face was gone. It made the frame more balanced. Mom told me when I asked. I nodded, pretending to understand, but something cracked inside me that never quite healed. That was the first time I understood what it meant to be edited out of your own family's story. Brooke's birthdays were carnivals. Balloons, live music, sparkly dresses. Mine were simpler, Mom said. You've never been a big celebration kind of girl. But it wasn't that I didn't like celebration, it was that I never got the chance to associate it with me. When Brooke won her first dance competition, we went out for ice cream and Dad made a toast. When I brought home a perfect science project, he nodded absently and said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Brooke helped you with the poster, right?" She hadn't. I remember standing there holding my little blue ribbon, feeling the air go thin around me. Over the years, favoritism became the wallpaper of our lives, never loud, never declared, just constant. Brooke got the bigger bedroom because she has more clothes. She got the front seat on family drives because she gets carsick. When I asked why it was always her, Mom smiled the way people smile when they think they're being reasonable. Because it's easier this way, Maya. That sentence would follow me for years like a ghost. By the time I was 12, I had learned to fold myself smaller. I didn't fight for turns or argue for fairness. Instead, I found refuge in building things. I'd collect driftwood from the shore and hammer together small towers in the backyard, calling them my lighthouses. I'd tape flashlights to the tops and watch the beams sweep across the night, faint and crooked but alive. In my mind, those lights were proof that even if no one saw me, I could still shine. When I was 15, I brought home my first report card full of A's. I laid it on the kitchen counter while Mom was icing another of Brooke's recital cakes. "Good job," she said without looking up. "You're lucky. Some kids have to study hard for grades like that." The word lucky hit harder than any insult. It made everything I'd worked for sound accidental. Brooke, of course, was gifted. She didn't need luck, She was born glowing. There was one night I'll never forget. Brooke had tripped during a performance, bursting into tears mid-routine. Mom rushed the stage. Dad stood and clapped to calm the crowd, shouting, "She's our brave girl." Later that evening, Brooke sobbed into her pillow while I stood at her doorway, unsure whether to comfort her or applaud the attention she'd already gotten. I said nothing. I just went back to my room and took apart an old desk lamp, curious about the wiring inside. At least the wires made sense. They behaved exactly as they were designed to. The worst moments weren't the obvious ones. They were the quiet omissions, not being asked to join a conversation, being forgotten in group photos, having achievements treated like background noise. It wasn't cruelty, it was indifference. And indifference cuts deeper because there's nothing to fight against. It just happens, again and again, until you start to believe you deserve it. Sometimes, when the house went silent after dinner, I'd walk out to the porch and listen to the ocean. I'd imagine all the lighthouses along the California coast blinking in rhythm, signaling to each other through the dark. I wanted to believe there was one blinking back for me. By 16, I had already learned the art of silence. It wasn't sadness exactly, it was survival. In our house, noise belonged to Brooke. The piano scales echoing through the hallway, the laughter of her friends spilling from her room, the applause when she performed at school recitals. My world existed in the pauses between her sounds. I started spending hours in the garage, surrounded by the smell of dust and metal, teaching myself to fix things. Old lamps, broken radios, discarded fans. I opened them up, traced their wires, and soldered them back together. It felt like building my own language, one that didn't require anyone's permission to speak. When I tightened a bolt or saw a bulb flicker to life, something inside me steadied. At least, I thought, wood and metal respond when you touch them. People don't always do that. That summer, I found a pile of driftwood by the shore after a storm and decided to build a small pier. It wasn't elegant, just a few planks nailed together, wobbling into the tide, but it gave me something no one else did, a place that was mine. Every evening after school, I'd walk down with a toolbox, adjust a hinge, sand a surface, or add another step. The ocean would push and pull, testing my work, and each time the structure held, I felt less invisible. Out there, I wasn't the quiet sister or the forgotten daughter. I was an engineer, a creator, a person whose hands could shape something that stayed. Brooke, meanwhile, was being called a born performer. Teachers loved her energy, her smile, the way she could light up a stage. Mom called her our star, and Dad agreed without thinking. They'd say it in front of me as if it were a weather report just stating facts. When Brooke got an award for a regional theater performance, the living room filled with flowers and relatives. When I brought home a certificate from the county science fair, Mom said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You've always been so lucky with those projects." Lucky. Always that word again, like my work was just coincidence in disguise. The difference wasn't just what they celebrated, it was how they remembered. Years later, if you asked Mom about our teenage years, she could list every role Brooke ever played. But she wouldn't remember the night I stayed up past midnight fixing the generator after a storm so the house wouldn't lose power. "Didn't your father do that?" she asked once, genuinely puzzled. I didn't correct her. Some memories weren't worth fighting for. At school, I found comfort in physics, the only subject that felt fair. The ocean tides, the weight of beams, the pull of gravity, they followed laws that never changed. I liked that kind of honesty. Equation didn't pick favorites. When the world outside felt unpredictable, I could rely on numbers to stay loyal. The night Brooke had her biggest high school recital, the entire family gathered at the theater. I came straight from shop class, grease still under my nails, sitting quietly in the back row. Brooke danced beneath golden lights, moving like she owned the air itself. When she stumbled slightly, the audience gasped, and Dad stood up, clapping louder, shouting, "That's my girl." After the curtain fell, I watched as they swarmed her, Mom crying, Dad kissing her forehead, relatives snapping pictures. I slipped outside before anyone noticed. The air smelled of salt and electricity, the way it does before rain. I walked the mile down to my small pier. The tide was high, brushing the bottom planks, and the wind scattered the sound of applause I'd left behind. I turned on my makeshift lighthouse, a tin can with a small bulb wired to an old car battery. The beam flickered once, then glowed steady against the waves. In that soft circle of light, I stood barefoot on the wood I'd built and let the loneliness roll through me like water. I didn't cry. I just watched the light pulse over the dark sea and thought, maybe this is enough to build something that answers back, even if no one else ever does. The day I left home, the air smelled different, like eucalyptus and brine. I'd been accepted to UC San Diego on a scholarship for coastal engineering, and as the car curved along Highway 1, I watched the ocean glinting beside me, endless and patient. It felt like the first breath after years of holding one in. For the first time, there would be no Brooke in the next room, no parents assigning roles, no audience to play for. Just me, the sea, and the wide unknown. My dorm was small, the kind of place where the walls hummed from other people's music, but I didn't mind. That first night, I unpacked quietly, opened the window, and let the smell of salt and eucalyptus fill the air. Freedom, I realized, didn't always feel like joy at first. Sometimes it felt like standing on a cliff, dizzy from the view. I worked 2 jobs to keep myself afloat, one at a lab studying tidal erosion, another at a campus cafe that smelled constantly of burnt espresso. Most nights, I'd come home exhausted, my shoes coated with sand and salt, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind that belonged entirely to me. No one compared me to anyone else here. I was just another student chasing deadlines and daylight. One evening, while sketching a beam structure for class, I noticed a guy sitting across the studio. His notebook was filled with rough lines and arcs, blueprints that looked more like art than engineering. He glanced up, smiled faintly, and introduced himself as Ethan Rivera, a marine architect major. His hands were calloused, ink-stained, and he spoke about ocean currents as if they were living creatures. On the table, he had drawn a concept for a pier that could convert wave energy into power. I remember asking him why he chose to design something so simple, so quiet. He looked up from his sketch and said, "Because the ocean doesn't need to prove it's powerful, it just keeps returning." I didn't realize it then, but that single sentence would stay with me for years. It was the first time someone described strength in a way that sounded like me. That night, we walked together down to the shore. The waves rolled in and out, steady and unbothered, and I felt something loosen inside my chest. I wasn't competing anymore. I wasn't invisible. I was simply there, one person beside another, breathing with the tide. After graduation, Ethan and I stayed in San Diego for a while, renting a tiny 1-bedroom near Mission Bay. We had nothing but a pair of second-hand laptops, 2 surfboards we never had time to use, and a shared idea we couldn't stop talking about. We called it Blue Current, a company that would use small autonomous drones to monitor coastal erosion and help communities predict how tides, storms, and climate shifts would reshape their shores. The idea was simple, but the mission felt enormous. To protect the fragile line between land and sea before it disappeared. The early days were brutal. We worked from a folding table pressed against the living room wall, the hum of the refrigerator serving as background noise to our arguments about code, battery life, and funding. We lived on instant noodles and half-burnt toast, slept in alternating shifts to test the prototype, and measured success not by money but by whether the drone made it back to shore in one piece. Ethan handled the technical side, aerodynamics, data algorithms, the endless math that turned motion into meaning, while I pitched investors, wrote grants, and learned how to manage a business on the fly. Every rejection email was another wave hitting the breakwater, but we kept rebuilding. There were nights when exhaustion wrapped around us like fog. I'd sit on the floor surrounded by piles of failed parts, cracked propellers, tangled wires, and Ethan would hand me a mug of coffee, his voice quiet. "You've rebuilt everything you've ever touched," he'd remind me. "Why stop now?" We laughed through failure because failure was all we could afford. Yet somewhere between the late nights and salt-stained notebooks, blue current began to take shape, fragile, persistent, alive. By the second year, we had our first breakthrough. A local marina commissioned us to use our drones to map the shifting sands around their docks. The data we produced was so precise that within weeks, city engineers started calling. Then came a contract from the California Coastal Authority, small but enough to keep the lights on. I remember standing with Ethan on the Venice Beach boardwalk, watching one of our first drones rise into the orange dusk. Its little blue light blinked steadily as it moved out over the water, and Ethan whispered, almost to himself, "It's strange, isn't it, to build something that sees everything except you?" He didn't mean it as criticism, but the words hit deep. I'd spent my whole life being unseen by my parents, by teachers, by a family that had no language for quiet achievement. And here I was again, creating a company that observed without being noticed. I realized then that maybe Blue Current wasn't just about data, it was my way of giving form to the invisible. Every scan, every line of mapping code, was proof that the unseen could still protect, still matter. The third year nearly broke us. A brutal winter storm tore through the Pacific, collapsing piers up and down the coast. One of our field stations was destroyed, taking months of equipment with it. I remember sitting in the car that night, watching rain sheet across the windshield, whispering, "Maybe this is the end." Ethan reached over, his hand steady on mine. "Then we rebuild," he said, echoing the same certainty he'd had the day we met. "That's what tides do." We did rebuild. We worked without sleep, recalibrated the drones, rebuilt the communication grid, and within a week, we were the only company able to provide real-time mapping for emergency response teams. Our data helped identify which coastal homes were still safe and where evacuation routes needed reinforcement. For the first time, the news mentioned Blue Current by name. A week later, a headline appeared on Forbes, "The Woman Who Saved the Coastline." I should have felt triumphant, but when I saw my name printed beneath that title, all I could think about was the sound of my mother's voice years ago saying, "You're just lucky, Maya." I wondered if she'd seen the article, if she'd even read past the headline. I didn't call to find out. A few months later, during a family video call I reluctantly joined, Mom brought it up casually between updates about Brooke's promotion. "Oh, I saw something about your company in a magazine," she said, waving her hand as if brushing sand off a sleeve. "Brooke just got transferred to Miami. Isn't that exciting? She'll be working with international clients now." I forced a smile. "That's great, Mom." Ethan, sitting beside me, muted his mic but leaned close enough for only me to hear. "We'll build what they can't see." His words weren't bitter, just clear. A quiet pact. Blue Current grew quickly after that. Universities wanted to license our software, coastal towns wanted to partner. We moved into a small office overlooking the marina, but we kept our old habits: cheap takeout, late nights, the same coffee-stained table from our apartment. I began to see leadership not as control but as translation, turning vision into something others could touch. Ethan managed the finances with his steady calm, keeping us grounded whenever my ambition outpaced our resources. When our first major funding came through, we didn't celebrate with champagne. We bought better batteries for the drones and a used van for fieldwork. That night, as we drove along the coast collecting test data, the city lights flickered behind us and the horizon stretched open like a promise. Ethan rested his arm on the window and said, "You ever think about how the ocean erases its own footprints every day?" I looked at him, smiling. "Maybe that's what keeps it free." He nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do. Build things that stand even when the world forgets who built them." It wasn't until much later that I realized those words had become our quiet manifesto. Blue Current wasn't born to make us visible, it was born to make a difference, to carve permanence from something as unstable as water. Still, in the moments when journalists asked about my inspiration, I sometimes wanted to tell them the truth, that it came from a girl once edited out of a family photo who learned to find light by making it herself. But I never did. I just smiled and said, "The tide teaches you to start again." That night, when the office was finally quiet, I stood by the window watching the dark water beyond the pier. The waves rose and fell in steady rhythm, each one erasing and remaking the shore. Behind me, Ethan switched off the lights and slipped his arms around my waist. "You did it," he whispered. "No," I said softly, leaning back into him. "We did it." Outside, a single blue current drone blinked over the ocean, a faint, pulsing blue light moving through the dark, tracing patterns no one else could see. By the time Ethan and I decided to get married, life had finally begun to feel steady, not extravagant, just solid in a way I'd never known before. Blue Current had grown beyond our apartment and into a real office, our team expanding, our lives no longer defined by scarcity. After years of building for others, it felt like time to build something for ourselves. We chose a vineyard in Ojai for the wedding, quiet, sun-drenched, surrounded by oak trees and hills that turned gold at sunset. I booked it 8 months in advance. It wasn't about luxury, it was about belonging. I wanted something simple, close to nature, the kind of place where love didn't need chandeliers to be visible. Ethan handled the logistics like he handled everything patiently, with spreadsheets, humor, and small sticky notes labeled, "Don't forget to breathe." For the first time, the idea of family didn't scare me. 2 months before the date, my phone rang. The contact name flashed across the screen, Brooke. I hadn't heard her voice in weeks. She sounded cheerful, breathless, the way she always did when about to drop something heavy in the most casual way possible. "Maya, you'll never believe this. We just booked our engagement party. Guess what? Same date as your wedding. Isn't that hilarious?" I stared at the phone, waiting for her to laugh, to add, "Just kidding." But she didn't. "That's the same day, Brooke." "I know. But the venue in Miami was only free that weekend, and Alex's parents are flying in from Europe. We can't change it. But don't worry, we'll totally celebrate you another time." 1. Her words were like a déjà vu of every moment I'd been sidelined growing up, sugar-coated with false brightness. "Another time. Later. You're independent. All synonyms for you don't matter right now." I hung up before my voice could shake. A few minutes later, my phone rang again. "Mom." "Honey," she began, her tone dipped in that practiced sympathy that never reached the heart. "I just talked to Brooke. Don't be upset, okay? Her fiancé's family can only do that weekend. You're independent. You'll understand." There it was again, independent. The word she used when she wanted to feel guiltless for abandoning me. I could almost hear her rearranging the story in real time. Brooke's event wasn't inconsiderate, it was unavoidable. Mine, on the other hand, was flexible. "Mom, it's my wedding," I said quietly. "I know, sweetheart, but it's just one day. Family is forever." Family. The word that once meant safety now sounded like an obligation I hadn't signed up for. I remembered all those birthdays that never quite belonged to me, all those photos where I was cropped at the edges. I realized this was the same script playing again, only the stakes were higher, and I was old enough to see the pattern clearly. That evening, I told Ethan. He was fixing a loose cabinet hinge, a small habit he developed to unwind from work. "So, what do you want to do?" he asked gently. "We can change the date. Or the place. Whatever you need." I shook my head. "No, I'm done moving dates for people who never showed up." He paused, meeting my eyes with that calm steadiness that always disarmed me. "Then we'll keep it. It's our day, not theirs." Still, that night, long after he'd fallen asleep, I sat on the couch scrolling through my old bookmarks. A list of properties I'd saved over the years, a secret ritual whenever life felt too small. One caught my eye, a $7 million beach estate in Malibu, perched on a private bluff above the Pacific. I had saved the listing months earlier, back when Blue Current landed its first major contract. It wasn't meant as a goal, just a dream, a quiet reminder that there were places in the world built for peace. I clicked on the photos again, wide glass windows opening to endless ocean, a wooden pier stretching into blue, a small white painted lighthouse at the edge of the property. The kind of home that didn't shout wealth, just whispered belonging. I stared at the screen, heart beating steady, and thought of every time someone had told me to shrink, to be flexible, to understand. I realized I didn't want understanding anymore. I wanted space, my own table, my own tide. I opened a notebook and began sketching not plans for a mansion, but for a life there. I drew where the long driftwood table would go, where the vines might grow, where friends could sit and laugh without calculation. By the time I looked up, dawn was creeping through the blinds. Ethan stirred, half awake, and saw me sitting there, surrounded by notes and light. "What are you doing up?" he murmured. "Just looking at something," I said, turning the laptop toward him. He blinked at the photos. "That's Malibu." "Yeah." He rubbed his eyes, studying the screen for a moment. "It's beautiful." Then he smiled, slow and sure. "You're thinking of moving the wedding there, aren't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. "If they can't come to our table, maybe it's time to build our own." Ethan reached for my hand, still warm from the coffee I hadn't realized I was holding. "Then let's make it something they'll never forget, not out of spite, but out of truth." We sat together in silence, watching the morning light crawl across the hardwood floor. Outside, gulls cried somewhere beyond the window. The ocean was calling again, not as escape, but as invitation. I closed the laptop and rested my head on his shoulder. "I used to think family was something you had to fight to belong to," I whispered. "Now I think it's what happens when you stop fighting." He squeezed my hand gently. "Then let's stop fighting." And in that quiet, the plan began to take shape. Not revenge, not rebellion, just reclamation. A decision born not from anger, but from clarity. The same clarity I'd once found in equations, in salt air, in soldering wires until the light came on. That night, before sleeping, I wrote a single sentence on a sticky note and pressed it to my desk. No more shrinking. By morning, I'd called the realtor. 2 days later, Ethan and I drove up the coast toward Malibu, the Pacific stretching endlessly to our left, restless and silver beneath the winter Sunday. The farther we got from the city, the lighter the air felt, saltier, quieter, as if every mile peeled away a layer of noise we hadn't realized we were carrying. The listing photos hadn't done justice to what waited at the end of the winding private road. When the house finally came into view, my breath caught. It stood on a bluff above a crescent of pale sand, its walls washed white by years of sea air. A narrow wooden bridge led down from the back deck to the beach below, and beyond it, a small pier reached into the water like an outstretched hand. At the far edge of that pier stood an old lighthouse, short, round, painted a weathered ivory that glowed faintly in the light. The sky stretched wide and clean, the kind of blue that makes you feel both alive and forgiven. The caretaker, an older man in a linen shirt and salt-streaked cap, greeted us by the gate. "You must be the couple from Los Angeles," he said, his voice softened by years of wind. "The owner moved abroad. The place has been waiting for the right people." He led us through the main room, vaulted ceilings, wide windows, the faint scent of cedar and seaweed clinging to the air. There were small imperfections everywhere, scratches on the beams, chips in the tiles, places where the ocean had left its mark. To me, that was what made it beautiful. It didn't pretend to be untouched. It carried its history openly, like someone who had survived and stayed kind anyway. When we stepped out onto the deck, the wind lifted my hair, carrying the tang of salt and lavender. I could see the pier below, the tide brushing gently against its wooden posts. The caretaker followed our gaze and smiled. "That lighthouse was built in 1942, he said. "Back then, ships used it to find their way through the fog. The light doesn't work anymore, but the tower still stands. The house waits for someone who sees it." That sentence lodged itself somewhere deep inside me. Someone who sees it. Maybe that's what I'd been looking for all along, a place, a moment, a life that didn't need to be explained or justified. Ethan turned toward me, his eyes catching the reflection of the sea. "You're seeing it, aren't you?" I nodded, unable to speak. A few minutes later, we were sitting at the long wooden kitchen island, papers spread before us. The pen felt heavy in my hand, the kind of weight that comes with choosing something permanent. When I signed my name, it wasn't just on a deed, it was a declaration. I will not wait to be invited anymore. If they won't come to our table, I said quietly, handing the pen to Ethan, we'll build our own pier. He smiled, signing beneath my name. Then let's make it strong enough to last. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling softly through the open door. It sounded almost like approval. We spent the rest of the afternoon exploring every corner, the narrow staircase that spiraled down to a private study, the balcony overlooking the surf, the tiny guest cottage tucked behind a row of cypress trees. Ethan ran his hand along the railing of the pier, testing its stability, already thinking in blueprints and reinforcements. I crouched at the shoreline, letting the cold foam touch my skin. The ocean felt like home, familiar, steady, unafraid to return no matter how many times it had been pushed away. That evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, the sea turned molten gold. Ethan stood beside me, the light catching in his hair. You know, he said softly, this place isn't just beautiful, it's you, strong, weathered, not trying to impress anyone. I laughed, shaking my head. You're saying I'm a lighthouse with a cracked wall. He smiled. I'm saying you're what keeps people from getting lost. For a long time, we just stood there, the wind tugging at our clothes, the waves rolling in with a rhythm older than either of us. The tide was high enough to touch the first step of the pier now, each wave wrapping around it like a promise. I watched the water rise and thought of every time I'd been told to bend, to wait, to make room for someone else's plans. For years, I had lived by the comfort of others. This was the first thing that belonged entirely to me. That night, after the caretaker left, we stayed behind, sitting on the deck with takeout cartons and a bottle of cheap white wine. There was no music, no noise except the hush of the waves and the low hum of crickets hidden in the grass. Ethan raised his glass. To new tides. I lifted mine. To building what no one else could see. Under the pale glow of the moon, we made a quiet decision. The wedding would stay on the same date. But not in Ohio, not in a place where anyone could claim ownership of our happiness. It would happen here on this cliff, by this sea, under the old lighthouse that had waited for decades to shine again. We didn't tell anyone. Not our parents, not friends, not even our small team at Blue Current. It would be our secret, a ceremony for those who truly showed up. I wanted laughter that came without guilt, vows spoken into open air instead of polite applause. Before we left that night, Ethan found the switch to the old lighthouse's power line. It sputtered once, twice, then went dark. The bulb's gone, he said. Maybe it just needs to be rebuilt, I replied, tracing the cold metal. He looked at me and grinned. Then we'll fix it. As we drove home along the coast, the ocean followed us in glimpses through the cliffs, silver, restless, alive. In the rearview mirror, the lighthouse stood small against the sky, dark for now, but still standing. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was, too. The first morning we arrived as owners, the air felt different, not brighter, just fuller, like the sea itself had been holding its breath until someone finally came back to listen. The house was quiet, but not lonely. Its walls carried the soft sigh of the ocean, its windows still fogged from salt and wind. We rolled up our sleeves and began. Ethan called a few local craftsmen, not contractors from the city, but old builders who had lived their lives by the rhythm of tides. Men and women whose hands were marked by sun and salt. Together, we patched the cracks in the deck, replaced loose boards on the pier, and sanded the rails until the wood shone like honey. Every nail driven into that house felt like a heartbeat returning. I painted the railings myself, the smell of fresh paint mixing with the brine in the air. We hung lanterns along the path to the beach, their glass catching the afternoon light like bottled fire. On the southern slope, I planted rows of sea lavender pale purple against the sand, bending gracefully in the wind. I wanted their color to greet every guest who walked toward the house, a reminder that beauty doesn't resist the elements, it dances with them. The kitchen became our workshop of warmth. Through a friend in Topanga Canyon, we found a chef named Marco, a silver-haired Italian who believed that a meal is a love letter you write in flavor. When I told him we didn't want a formal menu, his eyes sparkled. "Then we cook like family," he said. Together, we built a menu that tasted like the coast itself. Halibut grilled over orange wood, citrus and fennel salad, and tiramisu infused with sea salt and candied orange peel. "Warm, not fancy," Marco repeated, tapping his chest. "Food should hug, not perform." While the villa came back to life, Ethan worked on something that mattered more to him than anything else: the table. "No family table," he said, sketching on a scrap of paper. "Just one table for everyone who shows up." He found old driftwood along the beechwood that had already survived 1,000 tides and spent days planing, sanding, and sealing it himself. I'd sit nearby, threading strings of small lanterns that would hang above the pier, watching him shape each plank with patience. "You're giving the ocean a second chance to hold people," I teased. He smiled. "Or maybe it's giving us one." We built the table long and narrow, stretching from the courtyard to the edge of the pier. When the afternoon light hit it, it looked like a bridge between the land and the water, a place where every story could meet. Above it, we strung cables from the lighthouse frame to the house eaves, threading them with warm bulbs that glowed soft gold as evening fell. Every night, when we lit them, the reflection on the water looked like constellations had descended to dine with us. For the invitations, I refused to order anything printed or sterile. I spent days crafting them by hand, thick handmade paper pressed with dried seagrass, sealed with wax molded into the shape of an anchor. Each envelope carried a single line in my handwriting: "You're not just invited, you're seen." I wanted every person who received one to know this wasn't just a ceremony, it was an arrival. We decided not to mail hundreds. Just 27. Friends, mentors, the people who had stayed when it was inconvenient. Marco. The local builders. 2 of our early engineers from Blue Current who had worked beside us when we were broke. A few of my cousins who had never forgotten my birthday even when my parents did. Everyone else, the ones who hadn't shown up before, wouldn't even know where to find us. Ethan handled the gifts for the guests. "Something small," he said, "but with weight." He worked with a glassblower in Venice who created delicate jars filled with coarse sea salt, harvested right from the Malibu shore. We added hand-tied labels printed in soft blue ink. For showing up. It wasn't meant to be poetic, just true. As the villa took shape, I began to notice how the ocean changed depending on the hour. At sunrise, it was almost pink, like forgiveness. By noon, sharp and silver, the color of determination. But at night, under the glow of the new bulbs, it softened into deep indigo, the kind that makes you believe in peace. Some nights, I'd sit with Ethan on the edge of the newly restored pier, our feet dangling just above the tide. He'd rest his head on my shoulder, the wind tangling our hair, and say, "This place feels like it's always been waiting for us." I would smile, tracing my fingers over the grain of the wood beneath us. Or maybe it was waiting for us to stop waiting. We spent every day rebuilding, not out of desperation, but devotion. The house became a mirror of our relationship, practical yet gentle, imperfect but enduring. On the final evening before the decorators arrived, we stood together under the hanging lights, the smell of salt and paint and lavender mixing in the air. The lanterns swayed lightly in the breeze, throwing soft circles of light across the deck. "Do you ever think," Ethan said, "that maybe this whole time we weren't meant to chase approval, just alignment?" I looked out at the waves lapping beneath the pier. "Approval fades," I said quietly. "Alignment lasts." 9. The tide crept higher, kissing the first steps of the pier. The moon climbed over the horizon, full and low, turning the sea to liquid silver. We stood there, watching the water rise and fall around the posts, the light from the lanterns shimmering across its surface like a promise whispered by the earth itself. Ethan reached for my hand. "Maybe this time," he said, his voice soft, the tide's on our side. I squeezed his hand back, listening to the rhythm of the waves below us. Then let it carry us home. And for the first time, the word home didn't mean a place I was allowed to enter. It meant a world we had built steady, open, and entirely ours. It started with one phone call. I sat at the long driftwood table one quiet morning, the ink on the invitations barely dry, when I finally dialed a number I hadn't called in months: my cousin Aria. She had always been the one who remembered my birthday when no one else did, who slipped me $20 bills in Christmas cards with a note that read, "For ice cream and escape." When she answered, her voice carried the same warmth it always had. "Hey, stranger," she said. "What's going on?" I hesitated. For a second, the old fear returned, that instinct to downplay, to keep things small. But I took a breath. "Aria, the wedding's still happening. Same date. Just not in Ojai anymore." There was a pause, the kind that fills with memory. "Not in Ojai? Where then?" "Malibu," I said. "By the water. We're keeping it small, just real." She didn't even hesitate. "Send me the address. I'm in." Her certainty hit me like sunlight through fog. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed someone to say yes without asking why. By the next morning, the ripples had begun. Aria had apparently called Aunt Marianne, who called Uncle Ray, who texted Eli, my older cousin from Seattle, who I hadn't spoken to in nearly 5 years. My phone buzzed nonstop for hours. Eli's message came first. "Heard the family pulled a classic move. Don't worry, Maya. We're not missing your wedding. Flights booked." Then Aunt Marianne. "Your mother told everyone Brooke's event was the family's priority. But sweetheart, I think we've all attended enough of their priorities. This time, we're choosing heart over habit." And then, the one that made me cry, a short voicemail from Grandma Ruth, her voice frail but steady. "My darling girl, I may not walk fast anymore, but I still know where to go. Distance isn't in miles, it's in who shows up. And I'll be there. Save me a seat by the sea." That was when it clicked. For years, I'd thought I was the forgotten one, the girl left out of the picture. But now, people were stepping out of the background for me, for truth. Within 2 days, Aria created a group chat and named it the Real Tide Table. It was meant as a joke at first, but it stuck. Every hour, new messages poured in. Photos of renewed passports, screenshots of booked flights, emojis of seashells, waves, and lighthouses. Eli sent a selfie from the airport holding a boarding pass and grinning. "Told my boss I was going to a wedding. Didn't say which one." Uncle Ray sent a thumbs up and a photo of an old fishing hat. "Haven't worn this since 2003. Guess it's time." Aunt Marianne shared a picture of her suitcase open on the bed, half filled with sundresses and sunscreen. "Malibu, here we come," she wrote, adding a string of blue heart emojis. Even Grandma Ruth texted slowly, but proudly, a blurry picture of her plane ticket with the caption, "Hope they serve tea on the flight. Can't toast love with soda." Ethan would lean over my shoulder each night as I scrolled through the messages, his arm draped around me. "You realize what's happening, right?" he said softly. I looked up at him, the glow from the phone reflecting in his eyes. "What?" "You didn't lose a family," he said. "You found one." I smiled, though my throat tightened. "No," I said quietly. "They found me because I finally stopped hiding." It was strange, how natural it felt. No grand declarations, no public spectacle. Just people quietly choosing to show up, one message, one ticket, one promise at a time. Every evening, the group chat came alive with plans. Eli offered to bring his guitar. Aria volunteered to help Marco in the kitchen. Aunt Marianne said she'd take care of flowers. "Nothing stiff or staged," she texted, "just wild ones, the kind that look like they grew here on purpose." Grandma Ruth wrote again. "Don't forget the olive branches, darling. They mean peace. Bring some to the ceremony. Now." And suddenly, the house in Malibu wasn't just a venue anymore. It was a destination not for escape, but for reunion. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the long table Ethan had built, scrolling through the latest messages from the real tide table. Dozens of photos, a blur of excitement, laughter, love. People who had once been background characters in my life now stepping into focus. I realized something. Maybe family had always been there, waiting for me to stop standing in the wrong room. Ethan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "You look like someone who just saw the tide turn." "Maybe I did," I said. He kissed the top of my head. "You know what I love most about you?" "What?" "You don't build things to impress people. You build them to heal." I looked out at the ocean beyond the windows, the moonlight cutting a silver path across the water. Maybe because healing's the only thing worth showing. When we went to bed that night, the phone kept buzzing softly on the counter, new emojis, new confirmations, more seashells. But I didn't need to read them. I already knew what they said. The tide was coming in. And this time, it was carrying everyone who chose to stay. The morning of the wedding dawned like two separate worlds under the same Sunday. Across the country in Miami, the air was heavy with humidity and tension. Brooke's engagement party was set in a glass-walled hotel ballroom overlooking the bay, a place that shimmered with money but not warmth. The planners rushed around adjusting silver linens and floral arches dripping with orchids, their smiles tight, their eyes darting toward the entrance. Rows of white chairs stood waiting, too many of them still empty. Brooke paced near the makeup station, her golden curls pinned to perfection, her voice sharp behind her glossed smile. "Where's Grandma? Has anyone heard from Arya? What about Eli? They said they were coming." Her maid of honor looked up from her phone, her tone cautious. Their flights might have been delayed." Her mother, standing nearby in lavender chiffon, turned from the mirror, clutching her clutch bag a little too tightly. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she said briskly. "They'll show up. They always do." But even as she spoke, her eyes flicked toward the double doors again and again, scanning the lobby that remained far too quiet. Her father stood by the champagne table, fidgeting with his tie. "Maybe the traffic," he started, but his voice faltered when he saw the planner whisper something urgently to an assistant. A few of the staff had begun to rearrange the seating, pulling the front rows closer together to disguise the vacant space. On stage, the band played softly to no one. A photographer, trying to stay diplomatic, asked, "Should we wait a few more minutes before starting?" Brooke's smile twitched. "No, people will come." She didn't sound like she believed it. At that very moment, 2,000 miles away, the same sun brushed its golden hand across the Malibu coastline. The villa glowed under the honey-colored light of late afternoon. The sea whispered against the sand, the tide humming softly beneath the restored pier. Guests filled the courtyard, not hundreds, but enough to fill the air with laughter and something far rarer, belonging. The long driftwood table stretched from the house toward the water, wrapped in strands of lanterns swaying like captured stars. Sea lavender and olive branches lined its center, their scent mingling with salt and citrus. The ocean breeze carried the soft strum of Eli's guitar as guests took their seats, their faces glowing in the light that only truth can cast. At the far end of the pier stood Ethan, dressed simply in a white shirt and sand-colored vest, his hair tousled by the wind. He looked both calm and certain, like the shore itself waiting, unshaken. From the villa doors, Maya stepped out. Her dress was silk, ivory, flowing like water over stone. In her hair, she wore a sprig of sea lavender, the same color she'd planted months earlier by the railing. The guests stood instinctively, a collective hush falling over the courtyard. From the front row, Grandma Ruth lifted a small seashell high, its pearly curve catching the light. "For luck," she whispered, smiling. As Maya walked down the pier, the sound of the waves filled the space where violins might have been. The boards creaked gently beneath her bare feet, the wind brushing her veil toward the horizon. Every step felt like a release from the years of waiting, of silence, of wanting to be seen. The officiant, an old family friend of Marco's, stood between the ocean and the sky. His voice carried softly through the breeze. "Today," he began, "is not about who declined to come. It is about who arrived, who stood steady, who chose love without condition. For it is not presence that fills a seat, it is intention that fills a heart." Maya turned to Ethan, her eyes bright but calm. She took his hands and began her vows, voice steady despite the waves curling below. "To those who showed up," she said, her words carrying beyond the pier, before the tide turned, when it was easier not to, when silence was safer. "You remind me that family isn't measured in invitations, but in courage. And you, Ethan," her voice softened. "You taught me that love doesn't need permission to stand, it only needs somewhere true to land." Ethan smiled, his thumb brushing her palm. His own vow came like the echo of a promise long kept. "You don't need the world to see you to be real," he said. "You just need one steady shore, someone who never leaves when the waves rise." The breeze picked up, lifting the edges of her veil, scattering sunlight across their faces. Behind them, the horizon burned with color, gold bleeding into rose, rose into violet. The ocean reflected it all, a mirror of transformation. Grandma Ruth wiped a tear and whispered, "It's like the sea is giving them its blessing." Arya nodded, her arm around Eli. Finally, the tide's on her side. When the officiant pronounced them married, the sound of applause and laughter rolled across the pier, carried by the wind. Ethan pulled Maya into his arms, kissing her as gulls wheeled overhead. It wasn't grand or rehearsed, it was alive. The guests cheered, Marco waved a ladle from the kitchen door, and the lanterns began to glow as dusk descended. Later, as the sun dipped into the Pacific, Eli's guitar music drifted through the warm air. Guests gathered at the driftwood table, wine glasses catching the fading light. Someone took a picture, a wide shot of the table glowing beneath the strings of lights, the lighthouse flickering faintly in the background. Maya and Ethan sat at the center, hands entwined, laughter spilling from everyone around them. The sea shimmered violet and gold, the sky soft with twilight. Within an hour, the photos were everywhere. Arya posted the first one. "When love shows up, so does family. Number the real tide table." Eli added a video, Grandma Ruth clinking her glass and declaring, "May every tide bring us closer." Marco uploaded a photo of his tiramisu beside the glowing lanterns. Food should hug. Tonight, it did. The images spread fast, the driftwood table stretching toward the ocean, the lanterns like stars, the laughter frozen midair. And in Miami, where the party had dwindled to polite conversation and forced smiles, phones began to buzz. Aunt Marianne's post appeared first. Then Arya's. Then a cascade of others. The ballroom fell strangely silent as people turned their screens toward each other. "Wait," one whispered. "Isn't that the rest of the family?" Brooke, standing near the dessert table, frowned. "What do you mean?" She snatched her phone, scrolling. Her breath caught. There, on the screen, was Grandma Ruth under the Malibu sunset, holding a seashell above her head, her eyes shining. Behind her, the entire extended family, Arya, Eli, Uncle Ray, Aunt Marianne, all smiling, all there. Brooke's fiancé leaned closer. There, in California? At the head of the ballroom, her mother stood frozen, phone trembling in her manicured hand. The photo on her screen showed Maya and Ethan standing beneath the lighthouse's warm glow, surrounded by laughter and light. Her father's face paled as he leaned over to see, his jaw tightening. Around them, the whispers spread like ripples across the room. "They're all there? That looks incredible. Look at that table, it's beautiful." The photographer, sensing the tension, hesitated before snapping another picture. Brooke turned toward her mother, her voice a low tremor. "They all went to her wedding." Her mother didn't answer. Her phone slipped slightly in her hand. Her father swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. They froze. The music stumbled to a halt, the air heavy with something that wasn't just embarrassment, it was recognition. The truth had finally breached the surface. Meanwhile, in Malibu, laughter echoed under the lanterns, and waves brushed the shore like applause. Ethan poured wine into Maya's glass, the reflection of light dancing in her eyes. "To the family we found," he said. Maya smiled, looking out at the ocean, where the tide had risen high beneath the pier. "And the one we finally let go." The night deepened, the lighthouse glowed faintly behind them, and the sound of the sea became their only witness, eternal, forgiving, and on their side. The morning after the wedding was painted in soft gold. The ocean shimmered lazily under the Malibu sun, the tide low and forgiving. The courtyard still carried the scent of last night lavender, sea salt, and laughter that seemed to linger in the air. Empty wine glasses glinted on the long driftwood table, now speckled with petals and crumbs from Marco's tiramisu. Everything felt still, as if the world had paused to let the peace sink in. Maya sat on the porch steps, wrapped in Ethan's white shirt, her bare feet brushing against the cool wood. A mug of coffee warmed her hands, its steam curling into the crisp morning air. The sea below whispered gently, unhurried, and the horizon gleamed with that strange kind of quiet clarity that only comes after something right finally happens. Then her phone buzzed on the table beside her. The screen lit up. Mom. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. She could already imagine the tone, brittle, defensive, full of the same weary, rehearsed guilt that had filled her childhood. But something in her, maybe the version of herself who had signed her name on that deed, whispered, "Answer, but not for them. For closure." She picked it up and pressed speaker. Her mother's voice erupted instantly, sharp and trembling. "Maya, how could you do this to us? Do you have any idea how humiliated we were? Everyone at Brooke's engagement was talking about your little beach stunt. You made us look like fools in front of the entire family." "I didn't." Maya took a slow sip of her coffee, letting the warmth steady her. Ethan was beside her, silent but solid, his hand already reaching for hers. She didn't flinch or raise her voice. "I didn't do anything to you, Mom," she said evenly. "I just had my wedding. The people who wanted to come came." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sharp exhale. "You split the family in half," her mother hissed. "You've always been dramatic, Maya, but this was cruel. Do you know what it looked like? Your grandmother, your cousins, everyone abandoning us? People were whispering all night. You embarrassed us." Maya's gaze drifted toward the sea. The waves moved with effortless rhythm, coming, going, coming again, no apology, no permission. "I didn't split the family," she said quietly. "I just stopped standing where I wasn't welcome." Her mother went silent for a second, as if she couldn't process calm where she expected chaos. Then came the brittle laugh, the one Maya knew too well. "Oh, please. Don't make this about being the victim again. We only wanted what was easier. Brooke's event was already planned, the guests were coming. We couldn't just cancel everything for you." Ethan's grip on her hand tightened, a quiet anchor. Before Maya could respond, another voice joined the call, soft but firm. "Linda." Her mother froze. "Mother?" It was Grandma Ruth. "I'm here," Ruth said, her voice steady as the tide. "And I've heard enough." "Mother, please, you don't understand." "No," Ruth interrupted, her tone suddenly sharp. "I understand perfectly. I've watched you treat this girl like a second thought her whole life. Every holiday, every milestone, it was always Brooke first. And now you're angry that people finally saw the truth you've been hiding. Mother, that's unfair." "No, Linda. What's unfair is expecting love without effort. You say you wanted what was easier?" Her voice grew quieter, but every word landed like a wave against rock. "No, you wanted what required no courage." The silence that followed was deep enough to hear the faint cry of gulls outside. Maya closed her eyes, breathing in the sound of the waves. For once, someone else was saying the words she'd carried all her life. Her father's voice entered the line, low and tired. "We didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said. "We just thought Brooke's side had more people, more pressure. We thought you'd understand. You've always been the strong one, Maya." Maya's voice was calm, almost kind. That's the thing, Dad. I was strong because I had to be. Because no one showed up when I needed them to. And this time, I stopped waiting. Her mother's voice cracked. You make it sound like we chose sides. You didn't have to, Maya said. Her eyes met Ethan's, who gave her a small nod of quiet pride. You just had to show up. There was nothing more to say after that. The silence stretched long and heavy, but not bitter, just true. The kind of silence that comes when everything finally lands exactly where it belongs. After a moment, Ruth spoke again, her voice soft but unwavering. Linda, love isn't management. It's showing up. And last night, I saw what love really looks like. It looked like laughter, music, and honesty, things you traded for convenience. Her father exhaled shakily. Maybe we made it too easy to forget her. Maya stared out at the ocean, its reflection rippling gold. You didn't forget me, she said quietly. You just preferred the parts of me that didn't ask for anything. For a moment, there was no sound. Then her mother's voice, smaller now. We never wanted to lose you, Maya. Maya smiled faintly. Then you shouldn't have looked away for so long. No shouting, no tears, just truth. When the call ended, Ethan reached over and turned off the phone, setting it face down on the table. The breeze lifted a few strands of Maya's hair, brushing them across her cheek. He brushed them back gently. You okay? He asked. She nodded, her eyes still on the horizon. Yeah, I think this time, I finally am. They sat together in silence, the morning light spilling over the pier, the sea rising and falling in its eternal rhythm, steady, forgiving, free. A week later, the ocean was calm again. The house smelled faintly of citrus and salt, and the lavender by the railings had begun to bloom. The villa no longer felt like a retreat from the world. It felt like the world itself had adjusted to its rhythm. That evening, Maya stood in the courtyard, arranging the last few candles on the long driftwood table. Their flickering reflections shimmered across the wood like small, patient hearts. It was Ethan's idea at dinner, not to reopen old wounds, but to let them rest. No speeches, he'd said earlier, adjusting the lanterns. No defenses, just food and quiet. When the guests arrived, the sky was painted in amber and mauve. Brooke stepped out first, her posture hesitant but open, a soft nervousness replacing her usual polished glow. Behind her came their parents, Linda and Robert, their faces lined with exhaustion and something humbler than guilt, awareness. Maya met them at the entrance, barefoot, wearing a pale blue dress that moved with the breeze. She didn't hug them right away. She just nodded softly, motioning to the table. Dinner's ready. The evening light stretched long across the water as everyone took their seats. The waves lapped quietly below, the same steady rhythm that had witnessed everything: the fracture, the distance, the rebuilding. Marco had sent a special delivery from his kitchen that morning. Trays of warm bread brushed with rosemary oil, halibut grilled in orange wood, and a bowl of citrus tiramisu that shimmered faintly under the lanterns. No one spoke for a while. Forks clicked gently against plates, the sounds blending with the hush of the tide. The quiet wasn't tense. It was soft like the air before dawn. Linda finally broke it. The place is beautiful, she said, her voice catching slightly. It feels like peace. Maya smiled faintly. That's what we wanted it to feel like. Her mother set her fork down, eyes glistening in the candlelight. I used to tell people you were so independent, she said. That you didn't need anyone. I called it strength. She swallowed hard. But it wasn't, it was neglect. We called it strength when it was neglect. The confession landed like a tide touching the shore, soft, but with weight. Ethan reached beneath the table, squeezing Maya's hand once, grounding her. Her father exhaled, staring out at the water. Understanding isn't love, he said quietly. We thought if you understood why we did things, that it would make it okay. But we learned that too late. Maya looked at both of them, not with anger, not even with pity, but with a kind of quiet acceptance. I stopped needing apologies the day I stopped asking for them, she said gently. But I'm glad you came. Brooke's voice broke through next, softer than Maya had ever heard it. I wasn't trying to take everything, she said. I just wanted to be seen too. Maybe I got addicted to attention because it was the only way I felt real. Maya looked at her sister for a long moment, remembering every year that had built the space between them and how easily silence had grown roots there. You were seen, she said finally. Maybe by everyone but me. But you were. And now we both are. That. A quiet laugh bubbled from Brooke's throat, shaky, wet with tears. You always sound like the older sister in a movie. Maya smiled, the kind that didn't hide its ache. Someone had to. The conversation softened after that. The air grew warmer. Wine glasses refilled themselves. The light shifted from gold to rose to indigo. Ethan lit the lanterns above the pier, one by one, until the entire stretch glowed like a floating constellation. When dessert came, Maya stood, holding a small ribbon the color of sea glass. Everyone fell silent, watching her. She walked to the far end of the table, the very last seat, left empty on purpose, and tied the ribbon gently to the back of the chair. The fabric fluttered in the breeze, glinting faintly in the candlelight. For the girl who once waited to be chosen, she said quietly. No one spoke. Her mother's eyes shimmered. Her father bowed his head. Even the waves seemed to pause for a moment before rolling softly back against the shore. Ethan rose and came to stand beside her, his arm finding its familiar place around her waist. You built the pier, he whispered, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Now the tide's yours. She turned toward him, her smile small but certain. It doesn't feel like mine, she said. It feels shared. Later, as night deepened, laughter began to return, tentative, genuine, like a song remembered after years of silence. Brooke and Ethan talked about architecture. Her father helped Marco's assistant carry plates. Linda traced her fingers over the grain of the driftwood table, as if memorizing its story. When the last candle burned low, Maya rose and stepped to the edge of the pier. The moonlight spilled across the waves, turning the sea into a mirror of soft light. Everyone watched as she looked out over the water, her voice carrying gently on the wind. You don't need to fight for a seat on someone else's pier, she said. Build your own and watch who has the courage to cross. The group fell silent, the words hanging there, not as defiance, but as peace. Behind her, the candles flickered, the table shimmered, and laughter rose again, quieter now, but stronger. The lavender swayed by the railings, releasing its scent into the night. From the shore, the pier stretched into the ocean, solid, glowing, eternal. Lanterns reflected off the water like a constellation that refused to fade. The tide lapped gently against its base, a rhythm of forgiveness and rebirth. Maya stood there a moment longer, Ethan's hand in hers, before turning back toward the table, the light, the warmth, the family that had finally learned to show up. And as the camera pulled wide in the silence of that moment, the pier glowing under the moon, the waves whispering below, and the night full of second chances, it was clear that the tide had, at last, come home.